Good afternoon. Attorney Protective would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Time Management Tips for Lawyers, Reducing the Risk of Disciplinary Action and Malpractice Liability. With that, I would like to introduce your first speaker, Sally Field. Sally?
Thanks, Erin. Time management remains a really vibrant topic for lawyers, especially in the midst of these times of pandemic, where so many of us are working with new challenges and in new locations. But just like many Monday mornings, as I was driving to my office to do this webinar, I was making a mental list of all the things I had to do this week and into next week, and I was feeling a bit overwhelmed. Even though I speak on this topic, believe me, I continue to be a work in progress on time management. But with every new tip I learn, implement, and then try to master, I get a little bit better at balancing all the demands on my time. I hope today we can give you some new tips that will help you do the same thing. For most lawyers, our product is our knowledge and our time. The majority of lawyers still bill in time increments, even with the evolution of flat rate billing and other billing innovations. Even for plaintiffs' attorneys, who are most often paid on a contingency fee basis, effectively managing their time is an important component of delivering quality service to their clients and competent, even exceptional results on their matters. Lawyers who develop and take the time to develop good time management skills are likely to do things like have their documents and work product organized more efficiently, complete tasks quicker and, more importantly, in a sufficient time before deadlines, have a better work-life balance, complete more work in less hours, bill time more efficiently, and make a more positive impression on clients. Wouldn't we all like to be good at these things? Good time management skills will not only reduce your stress and make your practice more enjoyable, but it will improve your bottom line. And as we're about to talk about, good time management skills can minimize certain risks to your practice. So I'm going to start out by highlighting a few of the risks that poor time management skills pose to your firm. And some of those are things like not having enough clients, like getting paid for less than 30% of the work you actually do. And we'll talk a little more about that. Like having to spend time in front of your disciplinary board, like getting sued for malpractice, and like constantly worrying whether something got done or having to ask forgiveness from people like clients, judges, even the other members of your firm because you were late. None of these are positive, and good time management skills can help save you from most of those risks. Missed deadlines, which is where we'll start, are a leading cause of ethical violations and legal malpractice suits and are one of the risks of poor time management. Missed deadlines, interestingly, at least to me, have been a leading cause of malpractice claims as long as the ABA has been tracking that kind of data. 3 other top causes of claims also relate to time management, including failure to calendar properly, failure to file documents where there is no deadline, and failure to react to your calendar. Missed deadlines, of course, includes procrastination, as well as the more obvious mistake of not filing within the statute of limitations. The consequences of missing a single deadline can be severe, and often the damage to the client is irreversible. If you miss a key deadline in a case and it loses valuable rights for your client, what do you think they'll do? Will they sue you? In my experience, unfortunately, it's likely. Missed deadlines happen for a whole variety of reasons, including not having an adequate calendaring system or straying outside your area of competence or expertise. I'd like to share with you one of my very early claims experiences on missed deadlines, and this one taught me a lot. We got a call from a very distressed lawyer telling us that he thought he had missed the statute of limitations on a wrongful death case, so it was a big deal. To make things worse, the case involved a friend from church whose family was impacted by the death. This Florida lawyer did absolutely no personal injury work, but felt compelled to ask his friend from church when asked. What happened after he was asked to work on the case is more typical than you might imagine. The matter became what I call the dusty file on his credenza, mainly because he was out of his element and didn't really know how to start. Most days he probably came in and thought about the file, but again, didn't really know where to start. When he finally picked it up, he panicked because he believed that the statute of limitations had run, and so hence the call to us, his malpractice carrier. Needless to say, he was very upset. He felt he had let his friend down and didn't know how to tell him, and in fact, made such panicked comments as, "I'm going to have to change churches. I can't ever face him again." It was a very stressful situation. But as he relayed the facts to us, we saw a glimmer of hope. The individual involved in the wrongful death case did not die immediately after the accident. And so we thought there still might be a little bit of time. So we recommended he allow us to contact a local lawyer who did specialize in personal injury just to be sure we were right. As it turns out, thankfully we were, and the case was saved. And then it was transferred to a local lawyer with expertise in personal injury to handle. That particular one ended well, but that's not the most common result. There are a lot of lessons we can learn from this claim, but certainly one is how dangerous procrastination can be. So what are some things we can do to avoid missed deadlines or important deadlines? One is a commitment to using a comprehensive calendar and ticklering system that is easily accessible, simple to use, suited to your practice, and that sends out multiple automatic reminders. With calendaring systems, we really like to emphasize it is not one size fits all. If you have a solo practice, you probably won't have a docket clerk other than you to track the deadlines. So designing a system for a solo with the right safety net is going to be different than how you would design it for a larger firm with a designated docket clerk or docket intake person. But in either case, it should involve at least two calendars or systems that remind you independently of all deadlines. One thing that's super important is to calendar enough lead time for the completion of tasks that is well ahead of the actual deadline or due date. Again, what works for one person won't necessarily work for all. What works for me is to block an appropriate amount of time on my Outlook calendar for tasks that allows me to complete whatever the task is at least a week before it's due. If it's a big task, it's also going to involve it's often going to involve multiple blocks of time. And I take care never to dismiss the task until it is actually done and completed. As part of that, you may want to have a follow-up system that confirms the actual completion of calendar deadlines. I think that the absolute best tip for time management, for me, I learned earlier in my career from my first boss as a lawyer. And what he said to me, he said, "Come in every day and do the one thing you want to do on your desk, the very least, first." And he said if you do that, your day will only get better from there. That is great, great advice that has served me well every time I heeded it. And it is so freeing to come in and work on that nagging thing you don't want to work on first. It just kind of frees you up and gives you that sense of relief for the rest of your day. Losing business is another risk of poor time management. You will definitely lose business because of procrastination or lack of diligence, and there are many studies that prove this to be true. For example, there's an Acratus study of in-house counsel that found poor service is the number 2 reason for firing a law firm. On the converse side, a study that was done by Avvo found the number 1 reason consumers hired a lawyer was their responsiveness. And since we know that existing clients are the source of 80% of future business, satisfying current clients on all aspects of your service, including diligence and promptness, is very, very important to the sustainability of your practice. There are many impactful statistics on the high value of client retention to your practice. And as I was sort of refreshing my research a couple of weeks ago on this, I was surprised to find just how many different studies there were on this. For example, we know that firms that retain 98% of their clients from year to year are twice as profitable as those who retain 94% of their clients. It's amazing how that small percentage difference in retention adds up to big, big dollars. Also, we know that new client acquisition costs 15 times more than retaining an existing client. So really, no matter what statistic you read on client retention, the message is pretty much the same. Client retention is vitally important to your practice. We have a few cases on the slides, but I'm only going to highlight one of them, the Nettleton case. In Nettleton, the lawyer was found liable for malpractice, where he intentionally caused his client's cause of action to be dismissed because he was unprepared. He was too busy, didn't manage his caseload, and was not prepared to go to trial because he was working on another trial. And that's, if we sort of think back of it, those of us who have done trial work, that's not really uncommon to be working on a couple of big trials at once. But we can't expect clients to be understanding about us being overloaded. And I sort of think about it this way. If you walk into a store and you can't get help, or there's a long line to check out, it's frustrating. You will often leave without buying anything, or if you wait, you will definitely have opinions, not good ones, about the store. And your opinions could range from things like, they don't care about my business, or gosh, aren't they terribly disorganized, or isn't their staff just terribly trained? And really, aren't clients' expectations of service from you even higher than service in a retail setting? And just like the Nettleton case, we put ourselves in tremendous stress situations by not managing our workload and time adequately. I think most of us would like to avoid that. I'm going to talk a little bit about damaged reputation as a risk. Certainly getting sued for malpractice or having a disciplinary complaint can injure your reputation, particularly with current and potential clients. Warren Buffett, who has many wise sayings, has been quoted as saying, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently." And he's right. A fine speaker said something many years ago, it's probably over 20 years ago, and has really stuck with me. She said, "Clients will judge you on the things that they can." And when she first said that, I wasn't sure what she meant, but thankfully she explained it, and it's so true. Clients cannot always judge us on whether we did a better job than the lawyer down the street would have done, or whether the lawyer down the street would have charged less. But they can judge us on things like how they're treated, what our offices look like, and their perception of the helpfulness and competence of our staff. But timeliness is a really easy one for them to judge us on, and it's another one of those things that on which clients can and will judge us. If you're chronically late getting things done, get them done later than they thought you would or later than you told them you would, they see it and they'll judge you on it. Just as important, the failure to timely complete tasks or promptly communicate with your clients causes clients to lose trust in you. I think many of us miss the connection between lack of timeliness and lack of trust, but it is even addressed in the ethical rules. And we don't want to forget that a dissatisfied client typically will tell 10 to 17 other people, and the story they tell can become your reputation to a much wider audience of prospective clients. Lost revenue, like losing business, is a risk of poor time management. There are lots of studies that demonstrate how much time lawyers lose by not billing promptly. We all know the sooner lawyers record their time, the more details they tend to provide, and the more billable time they remember to actually write down and bill for. What happens if a lawyer does not record her time contemporaneously with the work being done? if the lawyer tries to reconstruct her time weekly, she typically will lose 25 to 30% of that time. If the lawyer instead tries to reconstruct her work monthly, she can lose as much as 55 to 70% of her time. And wow, that's a lot of time. Those lost hours and revenue they represent are compelling reasons to develop the good habit of contemporaneously billing. And I'm going to transition now to just talk a little bit about the ethical rules that encourage good time management skills. So beyond the business and malpractice risks of poor time management, good organization and time management skills seem to be required to meet some of lawyers' ethical duties. A lawyer's duty to exercise good time management skills in professional matters is addressed in the ABA Model Rules of Professional Conduct that have been adopted by most state bars. Rule 1.3 on diligence addresses time management skills when it says, quote, a lawyer shall act with reasonable diligence and promptness in representing a client. When you look at comment 2 to Rule 1.3, it provides, quote, a lawyer's workload must be controlled so that each matter can be handled competently. This comment, I think, highlights a big challenge for lawyers as demonstrated in the Nettleton case we just discussed. To comply, a lawyer will need to exercise effective time management skills in things like managing priorities on multiple projects, tracking and meeting deadlines, correctly estimating the time required for each task and matter the lawyer takes on, even turning away work when the lawyer should know that he does not have adequate time to promptly complete it. Comment 3 to this rule talks a little bit about procrastination and warns lawyers to avoid it because, quote, a client's interests often can be adversely affected by passage of time or changing conditions. The comment recognizes that in extreme circumstances, as when a lawyer overlooks a statute of limitations, or a lawyer doesn't complete something like a change to the will before the client dies, the client's legal position may be damaged or even lost. As we previously discussed, time delays are a leading driver of malpractice claims and disciplinary complaints. If you pick up any issue of your state bar journal that describes disciplinary complaints as they do in Texas, you will see how often diligence is a factor. It is in most of them. So now moving on to Rule 1.2 on communications, and it requires a lawyer shall promptly inform the client of any decision or circumstances that requires the client's informed consent, keep a client reasonably informed about the status of a matter, promptly comply with reasonable requests for information, among other things the rule addresses. The word promptly is used twice in this rule about communication. It appears clear to me that for communication to be effective according to the rule, it should also be prompt. To me, the most compelling comment to the rule is comment 4, which states, a lawyer's regular communication with clients will minimize the occasions on which a client will need to request information concerning the representation. And as basic as that sounds, it happens way too often. And in my view, if a client ever has to ask what's going on in their case, you have a serious communication failure. Rule 3.2 of the model rules requires that a lawyer shall make reasonable efforts to expedite litigation consistent with the interests of the client. The comments recognize that a lawyer may occasionally be permitted to request a delay for personal reasons. However, a lawyer cannot routinely fail to expedite litigation solely for their own convenience. According to the comments, the question is whether a competent lawyer acting in good faith will regard the course of conduct as having some substantial purpose other than delay. In other words, the fact that we get busy or didn't take the needed time to prepare is probably not adequate justification for delay. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meg to discuss the top 10 time management tips for lawyers. Meg?
Thank you so much, Sally. In light of the circumstances that we find ourselves, excuse me, the tweak for this presentation of the program is specifically the top time management techniques to help you overcome what I'm referring to as pandemic procrastination. I think procrastination, all of us procrastinate sometimes, but especially in these uncertain, anxious, stressful circumstances, procrastination seems to have reached an uptick. So all the topics that I'm going to address could certainly be categorized as general time management, but the angle I'm coming at with them is how to overcome specifically the procrastination we may find ourselves dealing with right now. So the problem of pandemic procrastination for lawyers basically is underscored by the fact that, as Sally just read, even though we're in the midst of this pandemic, we're still lawyers subject to the disciplinary requirements, subject to the ethical requirements of minimizing procrastination. And basically, Sally read most of the disciplinary comment, the ethics comment applied to procrastination, but I just want to underscore the very first sentence, which is, perhaps no professional shortcoming is more widely resented than procrastination. So they actually named that. So just to kind of start at the beginning, you can think of procrastination as either postponing something that you know you really should be doing now instead of later. You can look at it instead as a mechanism for coping with the anxiety associated with completing a task or decision. And actually, there are a wide variety of instigators of procrastination. You could be fear of failure, fear of success, which sounds counterintuitive, but as Sally mentioned, if you get overloaded with work, that can be another problem. It can be because you're a perfectionist or indecisive or just have a low tolerance for the less pleasant tasks we all have to do. We may be a little unclear about our various goals. There may be an imbalance between work and play. We may be fatigued. We may be stressed. And if you look at all of those together, you'll realize that this global pandemic really is a perfect storm of conditions to either trigger procrastination in folks that generally don't procrastinate, and those of us who procrastination is one of our go-to stress management techniques, it makes it even more exacerbated. New York Times columnist David Brooks on May 5th gave a certain perspective about why we feel so undone. He refers to the pandemic as the first invasion of America, a menace that has upended our daily lives and the daily lives of every American, and has rocked our ancient sense of security. So there's good reason to feel upset or even depressed about this. So basically, our lives have been completely altered with no playbook about how to manage this cascading series of losses and changes. Many of us are not only working in a different situation, we may have different caregiving responsibilities, so maybe our time is much less our own. And just for a variety of reasons, the pandemic is exhausting mentally and physically. And the thing is that can have a major deleterious effect on our mental bandwidth. So I just want to say, as Sally said, she's a work in progress. I will be the first to admit that these pandemic challenges hit me as certainly as hard as it hit all of us. And when it first hit and we kind of the dust started to settle, I basically had to go back to my anti-procrastination toolbox and pull out tools I hadn't used for years. So it was a good reintroduction to the basics. And I wanted to provide a whole toolbox of ideas for you all as well. And the first suggestion is don't assume you can be as productive as you were in the before times. When everything's been turned upside down, have a bit of self-compassion and try to avoid unreasonable expectations. But still, despite that, we still do have that professional responsibilities that must be addressed and addressed promptly and diligently. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you a variety of tools and techniques. So listen for the ones you think will work for you, and these are just suggestions, so tweak them and adapt them and apply them however works best for you. I may go into great detail about a certain technique, but that's really more illustrative than prescriptive. So there's no time management hard, black letter law. It's always whatever works best for the individual. So my first technique, number one tip, is just to start anywhere. Sometimes you just need a jump start. You need to stop thinking about everything you need to do and just to kind of start doing it. And sometimes that might be all you need, and then momentum carries you along. So if you really want to get the most about that, don't even worry about the best place to start, because you probably know what your major project is, and you just want to get the momentum back again. So just keep going on that. Start anywhere and see where that takes you. At least you're moving along. You've at least sort of woken yourself up from the paralysis of procrastination. Tip number 2. Actually, the way I describe it is work in 15-minute increments, but the broadest way to describe this tip is to work in specific increments, the length of which is entirely up to you. So let me start with the 15-minute increment approach, because I found 15 minutes is a really good time period in which to think of work, of a unit of work, because you can get quite a bit done in 15 minutes, but it's not so long to be daunting. So the classic anti-procrastination technique involving the 15-minute increment is you set a countdown timer for 15 minutes and tell yourself just for the next 15 minutes you'll work on whatever it is you've been procrastinating about, because you can do anything for 15 minutes. So you get in, you do the work. When the timer goes off, you force yourself to make a binary choice. And the first option is to stop working on that task because your commitment to yourself was just for 15 minutes and you fulfilled it. But the other choice is to reset the timer and continue for another 15 minutes. And the beauty of this technique is that I've observed that almost always when people get started, when the timer finally goes off, they're kind of into it. It's not as bad as they thought. Sometimes they even think, why was I procrastinating on it? It feels so satisfying to get something done. So it becomes generally more appealing to reset the timer and continue than it does to stop. And I know people who can end up working for hours at a time using this technique, where there's no way they would have started had they known they'd be working for hours. But every 15 minutes the timer goes off and gives them the option to have a guilt-free, well-deserved break. I described this technique at a seminar once, and a woman in the back row raised her hand and said, that technique sounds oddly familiar, and yet I've never heard of it before, I'm sure. What does that remind me of? And then the light dawned, and she said, yes, that's a snooze alarm. And I said, yeah, it is kind of. That's using the intermittent deferral principle in the positive sense. So the 15-minute increment is one. Another time management author recommends the 5-minute rule, and he says that although his tasks typically require 30 to 60 minutes to complete, I always start each one with the self-promise that I will work on the task for 5 minutes. If I can't stomach the task after that brief time, I permit myself to stop. And believe me, I gave myself a lot of permission during this pandemic year. However, as I gradually acclimated to the project, I managed to stick with it for extended periods. And then there's the author James Clear, who wrote a book called Atomic Habits, and he recommends even starting with 2 minutes. The idea is to choose an interval that's short enough that will actually get you started. And once you're started, you kind of get yourself onto a roll. So moving on to tip number 3. Basically, this is a conceptual way to think of your task management system. So before I dive into the specifics of it, I want to give a few caveats. Number 1 is, of course, if you already have a case management system, and I hope that if you have a volume practice that you do, I'm talking about things in addition to what's in your case management system. I'm talking about all those extra to-dos that just end up, floating around and are in addition to what's already documented in that system. I also will say this is in addition to the deadline reminders that Sally referred to in your at least dual calendar system, because the calendar system is very helpful for when it's time-related tasks, but what you also want to have is a system for tracking the various subtasks and projects and one-off tasks that are not necessarily tied to a specific time that you have to do it, or even a specific deadline, or even if it is a subtask that's part of a larger project that does have a deadline, you're not going to put each individual task in your calendar. So think of your to-do system as a way to manage all of those other tasks, and then you use it in connection with your calendar. I like to say, as Sally mentioned, she likes to block off time on her calendar to work on things in advance, and if that technique works for you, terrific. What I like to do, though, instead of blocking off specific time, is know when is discretionary time. Discretionary time is everything that isn't already devoted to things like this program or meetings or any things where you have to be in a particular place physically or virtually at a particular time. And during your discretionary time, how do you figure out how to use that time? And I want you to think of your to-do list, your to-do system, your task management system, whatever you call it, not just as, a list of things to do. Think of your to-do system as the written answer to the key time management question, which is always, what's the best use of my time right now? And at some level, you should always be asking yourself that question. But if you're constantly asking yourself that question without using some task management system to help you answer it methodically, then you'll just be answering it kind of ad hoc by the seat of your pants, and that's no way to be efficient and unstressed. So think of it, this is really a very valuable tool to help you manage your time. So with that in mind, the concept I like to help people visualize when they think of their to-do system is visualize a pyramid. What you want to do is construct what I call your to-do list pyramid. And the format in which you build this pyramid is almost irrelevant. It's whatever format you find most useful, most appealing, easiest to use. Whether it's handwritten, whether it's word processed, whether it's in a database or an Excel spreadsheet, whatever you find helpful. So I will use the term list to mean just generically a database, an actual list, just a kind of a bucket, to use David Allen's term, a bucket of places to put the various tasks. So back to the pyramid analogy. If you picture a pyramid divided horizontally in 3 levels, at the base of the pyramid, what that is that's basically a list that is represented by a list that covers everything. I call it the everything list, like the everything bagel, just everything's in there. So as you suggest, it's a place to offload basically everything you need to do from now as far as the eye can see until the end of time. And a lot of people get very anxious at the thought of creating a to-do system that is that comprehensive. I remember once I was working with a partner at a law firm and to help him get organized, and one of the first things I suggested was to do this data dump. And he really freaked out. He said, no, I don't want to do that, because if I did, I'd have a 37-page to-do list, and I don't want to deal with having a 37-page to-do list. And I told him, in some circumstances, a limited form of denial is a very valuable coping strategy, but this is not one of those circumstances, because if you don't put everything into a list or your system, you still have 37 pages worth of things you want to do, but instead of having them in a format where you can at least begin to make good decisions about how to approach them, they're just running around in your mind, freaking you out, stressing you out, running the risk of being forgotten, and probably gumming up your mental RAM. So it's important to realize that just because you put something into that everything list, that's not a commitment to ever doing it. It's merely a commitment to reviewing that list to help you figure out how you're going to use your time in the near term. So just put everything in there, and it usually will kind of organize itself, because clearly you want to put project-specific to-dos together, and you probably want to categorize things by marketing or administrative. And I suggest, by the way, this be a comprehensive list, so you might as well use the system to track everything you need to track for if you're managing your things in your household, or if you're responsible for other individuals, anything that you need, anything that's basically on your plate. So everything's in that list. And then periodically, and a reasonable time period is once a week or so, go through that everything list and pull out the tasks you want to focus on in the near term, in the next week. And when you have a large project within the everything list, you want to subdivide that project into its component parts. And the rule of thumb there is that each task, as you define it granularly, should stand a reasonable shot at being completed in a work session or less. So basically, you're sort of laying out the various steps you need to take. And a lot of people, when I suggest that, say, wait a minute, I'm so busy, and you're suggesting that I create a detailed to-do list for all of my projects? And my answer to that is, well, yes, because legal work is knowledge work. And one of the hallmarks of knowledge work is we need to figure out what to do before we can do them. So I'm not suggesting you do anything that you wouldn't be doing already. I'm just suggesting you do it in advance, in writing, methodically, so when it's time to figure out what to do, you've already done that, and you don't have to stop and rethink of all the things you need to do. So anyway, So you've chopped your big projects down into their component parts. So once a week you go through that everything list and pull out the tasks you want to focus on in the coming week. And here's where it's prioritizing an action, because I suggest that you pull out the tasks, the quantity you pull out is such that it is no more than the equivalent of what will fit on one word processed page. So whatever format you're using, you can kind of mentally translate to that metric. And the reason I suggest limiting it that way is you want this to be realistic. I think a lot of people have what they think of as weekly lists that there's no way they can finish everything in a week, even if they're working around the clock. And that just makes it more stressful and you feel overwhelmed. And a lot of time management is really mental gymnastics and reframing things to make them less stressful rather than more stressful. And this is one of those circumstances where you want to do that. So just have that one page of things you want to focus on in the coming week. And of course, you'll look at that in conjunction with your calendar, because if you have a lot of committed time, you'll have proportionally less time, discretionary time, to focus on things that are not time specific. So you want that to be reasonable. And then once a day, you want to pull out a very short, highest priority items on the list. And my tough love approach is not 6 items. And I should say this about the weekly list. Some people say, well, wait, there are 3 pages worth of things I have to get done this week. To which I say, okay, pull out the 1 page worth of the most important tasks. When you finish those, you can always go back and add more. Because for some reason, it feels much more satisfying to finish that initial list and add to it than it is to start with a 3-page list and only finish a third of it. So anyway, so you've got that 1-page list, and then you pull out the 6 most important tasks. So that's even assuming you have basically most of your discretionary time during the day. If you have back-to-back Zoom meetings, then it may even be fewer than 6. So this is, again, prioritizing an action. And within this 6-item list, then you want to prioritize the tasks. By the way, so you don't prioritize the tasks in the everything list. You don't prioritize it in the weekly list. I always think you should wait until the tasks have kind of bubbled close to the top to actually prioritize it, because there's no point in figuring out if something's number 27 or 28, because you should be working on number 1. So once you have your prioritized list, and it's buttressed by, and that's the top triangle of the pyramid, and that's buttressed by the intermediate layer of the pyramid, which is your weekly list, and that's supported by the bottom layer of the pyramid, which is your everything list. So what you know then is you're not distracted by that unsettling thought that there's something else you should be working on. You have a reasonable idea that, yes, this is appropriate to work on, and you prioritize it so it's crystal clear what is the number 1 priority. Once you have a prioritized to-do list, that allows you to do what I call honor the to-do list. And what that means is you stick with your list, your plan, in the order of priority, unless you make a conscious choice that circumstances have changed sufficient to justify going off the list or revising the list. Because the time management, the to-do list is just a tool. Honoring it is the technique of using the tool effectively. And if you think in terms of honoring the list, as one of my clients once put it, she said, "It is not my job to complete every item on my list. It is my job to make judgments about the relative priority of the items on the list and to be responsible for those judgments." So what that means is honoring the to-do list means you're always, at some level, asking yourself, what's the best use of my time? But you're using this prioritized list to make answering that fairly easy. And if something else comes up, if some emergency arises, or if somebody you're responsible for needs your attention and that's your number 1 priority, you're still honoring your to-do list as long as whenever you go off the list, you stop and say, is this really more important? And sometimes the answer is absolutely it is. So what that does is that solves the problem of being frustrated by saying, oh, I didn't finish everything on my list. Because the goal is not to finish everything on the list. The goal is to honor your to-do list so that you're using your time effectively during the time that you have decided to devote to work. So, and I really like the visual of the to-do list pyramid, because the apex of the pyramid is a single point. And your goal is to figure out what that one task is and then to focus on that task, because literally you cannot focus on more than one thing at a time. So underlying the to-do list pyramid, the foundation of the pyramid, is what I'm going to describe in tip number 4. It can be so helpful to kind of get a 30,000-foot view of your work and of your life to figure out what is important to you, what is it you want to accomplish, even especially during these, I'll call this the sustained crisis mode that we're all living in right now. It's probably a good time to hit the reset button and revisit those goals. And a good rule of thumb for setting good goals is the acronym SMART. You want your goals to be specific. You want to clarify exactly what it is you want to accomplish. And as always, having the goal is kind of less important than the exercise of thinking through what it is you want. So actually get this in writing so you can clarify that and you've thought it through. Secondly, it's measurable, so you can tell for sure when you've reached your goal. You also want your goal to be activity-oriented because, especially as a lawyer, there's so much beyond your control. So you wouldn't want, of course, we all want to win all of our cases, but your goal should not be to win the case because that's not entirely within your control. It should be something more like, to provide excellent client service in a timely manner and, do the best job I can on each individual element, something like that. So if circumstances beyond your control result in the outcome you don't want, at least you've done everything that is within your control to try to get there. Next, your goal should be reasonable. Your goal should be high enough to inspire you, but not so daunting that they overwhelm you. And finally, they should be time limited. As we all know, we can, spend as much time on something as we give ourselves. So you want it to be a set deadline so you can work efficiently as you're aiming towards that deadline. Business philosopher Jim Rohn once said, we need lots of powerful long-range goals to help us past the short-term obstacles. And that's one of the benefits of having long-term goals. So periodically revisit them and review them and use them to inspire you. So tip number 5, this is something I actually recommend even in the before times I recommend it, but it has certainly come to the forefront now. We should use this as an opportunity to get really, really good at compartmentalizing, to get really good at setting aside our worries so that we can focus on the work in front of us. Because yes, I'll agree there are many concerning things happening these days, but not getting our work done doesn't make it any better. And so we might as well, use whatever cognitive techniques we can to get our work done, and there'll always be time to worry afterwards. So specifically, to compartmentalize your worries. Now, this may sound a little odd, but I never know what techniques will resonate with people. So my first suggestion is to designate specific worry times. And, of course, the benefit from that is not so much that you know when you're going to worry, but during your non-worry times, you don't. You defer the worry until when you have decided to do it. So whether it's a particular hour of the day, whether it's every 5 minutes of the hour, as long as you know for sure you're going to give that worry plenty of time, it shouldn't be distracting you while you're trying to do your work. Next, consider dealing with your worries in writing. And a good exercise is instead of imagine what you would advise a friend who came to you with your exact problems, because we're so good at telling other people what they should do, and it's a lot harder to apply that to ourselves. So, actually, journal. And when I say journal, I don't necessarily mean by hand. I actually have a Word document that's called Journal, so pull that up. And I find if you write, it helps you to clarify things. It helps you to be to kind of offload whatever is on your mind. And there's an interesting benefit that once you've written it down, once you've encapsulated it, once it's there, you kind of said, okay, I've dealt with it. There it is on the page. Let me leave it here for now. Go do my work. I can always, come back to that later. When you're trying to figure out how to manage your worries, one of the things that can be very helpful is to ask yourself, what, if anything, can I do about whatever it is I'm worried about? What specific steps can I take to reduce the risk that whatever I'm worried about will actually come to pass? And especially now, there are a variety of things that we can do to minimize the risk of this, that, the other. So you figure out what that is. You figure out the most recent best guidance is. You figure out what your own risk tolerance is. You implement that. But the idea is you focus on what you can do. You figure out what is within your control, and that's generally just yourself, and sometimes not even that. You figure out what's within your influence, and that's sometimes other people and not even that. But there is so much that's beyond our influence or control. And the point of this exercise is to get to the point where you refuse to waste your time or energy worrying about anything beyond your influence or control. If there's something you can do to mitigate the thing you're worried about, of course do that. But if it's completely beyond your control, that's to say, you know what, I'm just going to, focus on the work and let the worries happen. Because just the worrying, unless that's your hobby, why engage in that? And I'll admit, this is something I'll sometimes, get to that point, and then I'll fall away from it and get to that point. And it's hard to stay there, but it's certainly worth the effort to try to get there. So the last bullet for tip number 5 is, okay, so we'll admit that all of us are procrastinators sometime. Fine. Turn that to your advantage. Procrastinate on your worry. This is the saying of that brilliant philosopher Scarlett O'Hara, the I'll think about it tomorrow approach. And that is actually a brilliant way to think about things that you can't do anything about today. And if you get anxious about it, it will reduce your ability to do whatever it is you have to do. So learning how to put that off is a very valuable skill. And unless you think that's a little too touchy-feely for a lawyer kind of seminar, let me share with you the words of Susan Estrich, who's a law professor at USC. And years ago, she wrote about how she overcame her worry-wart habit. And she said, you might as well assume that things will turn out all right, because if they do, you'll regret all the energy you wasted worrying that they wouldn't. And if they don't, your worrying obviously didn't help. So you might as well at least have enjoyed the time beforehand. You'll never look back and say, I wished I'd worried more. Now, this quotation came from well before pandemic times, so I think it is a little glib to say enjoying the time. So perhaps we might think of it as making it a little less miserable than otherwise. So defer. This is where you want to push that off into the future. So moving on to tip number 6. The old joke, can't live with it, can't live without it. I feel that way about the news these days. Can't live with it, don't really like it, but can't really stop looking at it. What you might want to do is embrace what I call strategic ignorance. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I alluded to it when my client didn't want to think about everything he had to do. There are times when it actually is a wise strategy just to disregard things. The old saying where, ignorance is bliss? That's not the whole saying. The whole saying is, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And I would submit that it's probably folly to follow the ups and downs of the 3-minute news cycle that we seem to be having now, because anything major that's happened, it'll still be there at the end of the workday and you look at it. So I suggest you experiment with of trying to avoid the news and social media, except for pre-planned specific times to learn the basics. Some people suggest 2 blocks of 15 minutes, and some people even suggest setting limits so you're not doom scrolling and going on. And I'll admit I feel a little bit like a hypocrite suggesting this, because I'm as guilty of this as anybody, but I try to put limits on that. So I'll wait until the end of the day, and then it's like, okay, this is my Twitter hour. Let's see what's going on, and just kind of knowing what's happening or what's not happening, it kind of scratches that itch. But at least it's only that hour at the end of the day. It's not during the day when I should be doing work. So as with all of these techniques, experiment and see if it works for you. We were chatting in the time before we went live about escapism, and I highly recommend it. Movies, TV, books if you can concentrate. Escapism can be a very valuable coping tool during this time. Tip number 7. I'm sure you've all heard about that flow state. Sports athletes talk about being in the zone. It's when you're concentrating and focusing so thoroughly on the task at hand that you don't even notice the passage of time and you really don't think of anything else. And I think it's actually a wonderful thing that we still have our work to do, because we can use our work as a way to get away from our worries. So you can try to set up the circumstances to encourage yourself to get into that flow state naturally by getting your to-do list up and running and avoiding the news. Or you can affirmatively try to set that up by just before you start working on a task, just take a moment and just close your eyes and focus on your breath and think, okay, let me leave the past behind, let me forget about the future, let me just focus on the present moment. And then in the last 3 breaths, you say, okay, I'm going to be alert and focus and attend to what's in front of me. And you'll find that when you do that, work can be a nice escape from real life. So this is, if you want to get further into that, there's a marvelous book by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi that's a while back called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, and I highly recommend that. And there's also a more recent take on that by an author named Cal Newport, who wrote Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World. Tip number 8, and by the way, all of these tips kind of work together, and this is a really bedrock keystone tip for number 8, is to give yourself some structure. And I chose that word strategically because I don't want to say schedule. People don't like schedules. You feel locked into it if it's a schedule. But some structure so that each day you don't have to kind of reinvent, okay, what's going to happen here. And I say this, by the way, if it's at all possible for you. If you're a single caregiver at home with somebody who needs your attention, you're just kind of hang in there and just do the best you can. But if it's at all possible, if you have any control of your own time, you want to think about how can I set up my day so that I know when I'll be working, when can I work best, I know when I will have breaks, when can I look forward to things. Because the benefit of having a schedule routine with clearly delineated work times, it facilitates sharper focus and increased concentration. So think of optimizing your work schedule as sort of a trial and error thing. You want to continually observe how you're working and implement changes as you see that they work better for you. And the goal is to make careful, conscious decisions about how you arrange your schedule and try to get into it as a habit so you're not reinventing the wheel each day. And this is one tip that I've really taken to heart. And what I've finally settled in on is I think of my day in 3-hour chunks. If I get to bed at a reasonable hour, I do wake up early, so I think of 6 to 9 as the first chunk, and I either, exercise on exercise days or, get that 3 hours worth of work done, and then breakfast is at 9, and then, breakfast and get things done, and then back to work, and then lunch is at noon, and then so have that, clean up, and come back, and then, a break and a little snack is at 3 o'clock, and then come back and work till 6. And I felt like such a genius coming up with this approach because all I thought about was I just need to get to the next break. I just need to get to lunch, just need to get to snack, just need to get to the end of the day. And you can do it for 3-hour periods. And of course, I laughed myself silly when I realized this is nothing that I invented. What I basically reinvented were the Benedictine monks' canonical hours. So maybe great minds think alike. Maybe it's the way the human mind works. But if you think about just think about those 3-hour chunks, which basically is 2 hours. The first hour is a meal or resting or doing some work, and then 2 hours of work. And I just find that rhythm worked well for me. But find what rhythm works best for you. But your idea is respect your schedule. The goal is to get tired but not exhausted, and take real breaks when it's time to stop working. Try to even stop thinking about working, and don't feel guilty about it, because this is part of your overall strategy to maintain a sustainable pace to maximize your productivity. So I'll mention this as well. One of the things that ironically I've noticed is some people, they love working at home. They say it's great, don't have to deal with the commute, it's wonderful. But I just want to point out that a traditional commute actually has some benefits. Driving into work, it gives you kind of an on-ramp. It gives you time to mentally prepare for work. And then coming home afterwards, it allows you to disengage. So those buffer periods are very helpful in giving yourself a good kind of mental work-life balance. So if that's something you don't have and you find that you miss, it's simple enough to recreate it. And it sounds silly, but if it's an issue for you, just try it and see how it works. So in the morning, literally just go outside and walk around the block and come back in. And that, 5-10 minutes, that's your commute. And during that time, that's when you mentally prepare for work. So you come back in, you're at work, and then at the end of the day, you go back out, and if If you're a little compulsive like me, you'd walk around the block the other way coming home, and then you come back and, open the door and say, hi, honey, I'm home from work, and extra points if you're just saying that to your cat or your plant. But recreating those buffer zones can be very helpful. So tip number 9. Especially now when we're all dealing with so much stress, it's so important to prioritize taking good care of yourself without guilt. It's part of your strategy to be the best lawyer you can be. So, give yourself reasonable exercise so that, it's hard to think clearly mentally when you aren't feeling well physically. Give yourself adequate rest. Take these regular pre-planned breaks. Try to set up a sleep schedule so you get to bed at a reasonable hour, and follow good sleep hygiene. Get some exposure to sunlight, limit caffeine. Try to maintain a regular sleep schedule throughout the week so you get into your circadian rhythm and work with it rather than against it. So getting to bed is one thing. Getting to sleep is something else. And so I do have 2 suggestions there. One is, everyone's saying meditate, and one of the things I've heard when they talk about meditation is they say, now don't lie down and close your eyes because you might fall asleep. And I heard that, it's like, ooh, a way to fall asleep. So download one of those meditation apps and do it in bed with your eyes closed. It is one way that may facilitate falling asleep if that's an issue for you. Personally, I really like the app called Calm, and I'll admit it's not the meditation part of it that I use to fall asleep. They actually have what they call sleep stories for adults, and it's basically a bedtime story. And it sounds so silly, but it is, at least I have found it to be 100% effective. And I've relearned why little kids like to listen to the same story over and over and over again. It's because when you've heard the story before, you don't have to really listen to it. It kind of just washes over you like a comforting wave. So I whenever there's any issue, I just turn that on. And there's one particular story called Wonder acted by Matthew McConaughey. And I have to tell you, I have no idea how the story ends because I've never made it all the way to the end. So it is just a blessing to have this tool so you can fall asleep. So whatever works for you, but I recommend that as very helpful. The next technique is to take care of yourself, is to truly honor your leisure time. Especially in overcoming procrastination, knowing that you've got some well-earned leisure to look forward to means that when you work, it's time to work. When you play, it's time to play. And you should build this guilt-free play into your schedule so that remember back in the before times when you actually had vacations and things? Remember how incredibly productive we were the day before a vacation? You can use that phenomenon in a micro sense by knowing that you're going to have a movie you want to see, a Netflix show you're binging on, something that evening so you can focus on tasks for the day. Finally, my last tip is, if you're a classic procrastinator and you find yourself procrastinating even more during this pandemic, try to be aware of when you're thinking in terms of the classic procrastinator mindset. And as soon as you realize that, kind of say to yourself, stop, let me replace it with the producer mindset. And here are the mindsets. Procrastinators think I must, whereas producers think I choose to. Procrastinators think I have to finish this, whereas producers say, when can I start? Procrastinators think, oh, this project is huge and get overwhelmed, whereas producers say, I'll do one small task. Procrastinators say, I have to be perfect, and they paint themselves into the corner of the paralysis of perfectionism, whereas producers say, I can be human, I know I'm going to make missteps along the way. If I start sooner, I can fix it up later. And finally, procrastinators tend to think that they procrastinate on fun, rest, and relaxation so that they think of their lives as just work, and that's a very gloomy way to look at it, whereas producers say, I choose to make time for reasonable fun, rest, and relaxation no matter how busy I am. It's the work hard, play hard approach. Well, I hope I have kind of polished up those tools in your anti-procrastination toolbox. I hope you find them helpful. And I'll just ask Sally, is there anything you'd like to add? Any final thoughts?
I would like to underscore a couple of things, Meg, and I just have to say your focus on this is so timely. I myself was taking a lot of notes. I love the buffer period because I know before I started coming back to the office part of the time, I didn't realize until I did my short little commute that first day, how much I relied on that time. And so I love your buffer period suggestion. I think that was really great. And also the I won't be able to say this right, compartmentalizing, excuse my pronunciation, your worries, because I think, I have to work on that. I'm definitely a work in progress on that, but that one really spoke to me, and I thought that was great. So thanks, Meg. Some really great, useful stuff today. I think with that, we're going to turn it over to Erin for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Meg. But with that, we do have some great questions coming in. One, Meg, is I think you mentioned 2 book names, and a few people are asking if you could repeat the name of the books.
Sure. And I mentioned several books, but I think the ones that people mentioned were the ones on flow and deep work. If that's not the case, someone ask him. But one is called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience by, and I learned how to pronounce this, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and it's Csikszentmihalyi. If you Google flow, I think that will pull that out, because he's a psychologist, and he's kind of the father of that approach. And a more recent application of that is by a gentleman named Cal Newport, and he wrote a book that's published in 2016 called Deep Work: Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World. And he had a very interesting approach, because his basic thesis was, especially now with everything online and internet and email and buzzing and alarm, we are not used to doing one thing for more than a few minutes, and that fosters a mindset that he called McThinking, which I really liked, because it's kind of the opposite of deep analysis and deep thinking. And especially as lawyers, we really need that in order to do our best work. We don't want to just stay on the surface. So I'm going through my notes to see if there were any other pair of books that I mentioned, but I think that is, yes, I think that's the only one. That must be what was referred to.
Okay, great. Thanks, Meg. Another question that came in was, when feeling overwhelmed by your daily to-do list, do you recommend starting with the easiest task or the hardest task?
Well, can I jump in on that? Because Sally already answered.
Sure, yeah.
For her. Sally likes the worst first. And I have to laugh, because we've done this program before, and every time, I think you've said it before, and every time I hear it, it's like, that's a great idea. So it's nice to get reminders of things that we already know. So yes, worst first is a classic approach that works for many people. But what I want to offer is an alternative if for some reason worst first doesn't work for you, because I always figure it's good to have options. And the approach is to get to, what the worst is, and you really want to get to that quickly, but you come in and think, oh, let me just clean up all these little dippy administrative tasks first. Fine. Give yourself permission to do that, but put a strict time limit on it. So, for example, maybe 30 minutes or maximum an hour. And I call this the turnaround time. So before you start on the little task, as a way to avoid doing the worst task, before you start on it, give yourself a definite cutoff time, maybe even set an alarm so you can't cheat on it. And the reason is, when the hour is up, know in advance that you're not going to want to start the worst first. Know that you're going to want to continue. So you want to kind of save yourself from your best self. Don't give yourself the option to rethink and renegotiate that time. And I call it the turnaround time, because that's a term I've stolen from mountain climbing. Turnaround. I'm never going to be climbing Everest, but I'm an armchair junkie of Everest ascents. And especially on Everest, you have to stick to the turnaround time, because as one mountaineer said, getting to the top is optional, getting back down is mandatory. So the turnaround time is, unless you're within a spitting distance of the summit, when it's 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, you turn around at that time without extra thinking about it, because you're not going to be thinking clearly. You're going to want to say, oh, I've come this far, let me keep on going, we're almost there, and you'll run out of energy and oxygen and daylight to get back down safely. So the very plebeian analogy is, assume that after the hour of doing the easy task, you're still not going to want to do the worst task. But once you've done that, that's all you're going to permit yourself. set the timer, and then do the worst thing. So it's either worst first or worst a very close second. And then you will feel so much better afterwards.
Great. Thanks, Meg. Another question that came in was, I appreciated the feedback about keeping the to-do list short. Where should all the other tasks go then? I have extremely long to-do lists that stress me out constantly.
Well, that's where you should throw everything into what I call that everything list, and it might even be a series of lists. And the beauty of that is you actually should not be looking at that frequently. You don't want it to stress you out. You only want to have it there to throw your thoughts into so you don't forget them. But once you have your to-do list pyramid system up and running, you should only be looking through that everything list, once a week or so as you create your weekly list. Because the beauty of building that pyramid is you can and you should forget about everything that's not at the apex until it's time to figure out, okay, what's the next priority? Because that's another example of the strategic ignorance. You have a big long list, so don't worry about it now. Just focus on, what's in front of you, what's the one thing you're working on today, rather than everything else. So, what's interesting is it's a lot easier to forget about it when you know it's in a list, and you're not going to really, permanently forget about it because you can rely on the list. Sally, do you have any tips on how to manage that?
I was about to underscore one thing that I think you said, which is you do have to go back and revisit that list because something can be more minor and become more major just because of the passage of time, and all of a sudden it becomes hot. So I think it's really important to go back and revisit it. And for me, I have some days where I will pull a bunch of things off my list, and I think of it as death by 1,000 cuts. I've got so many little things that each one's has to be done, and I sometimes have a day where I'll say, okay, this afternoon I'm going to work on doing all those little tasks. Again, that's what works for me. I'll say I love the checking them off, so I'm going to work through a bunch of those once I know that the big stuff is done. But I do also, as Meg said, do a master list, so I don't have to remember it because it's written on a piece of paper.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Another question that came in, what tips do you have for managing unexpected interruptions like phone calls that interfere with the completion of the to-do list?
Sally, do you want to take a first stab?
Yeah, I'll start first. I'm sure we have. Okay. I'm sure it's. I do not. My if I'm working on something that I have had to block time on my calendar, as I described earlier, then I, because we have caller ID. Unless it's somebody that I know I have to pick up the phone right then, I let it roll to voicemail. If I'm not working on that big block of time where I know it's something I really have to crunch through, that because I so hate to return phone calls, I'll generally pick up the phone. It depends on what I'm working on, what's in front of me, which way I go. But generally, if I am working on a big project and I'm in that focused time, I don't like interruptions, and I don't pick up the phone unless I see it's someone who outranks me in the company or something where I know it's important for me to pick it up. What about you? What do you think, Meg?
Yeah, that's basically exactly what I do, and my mental gymnastics to justify that to myself is that ultimately, given technology, we can always turn things off. And if for some reason we've decided that we're not going to because we may be expecting an important call from somebody in the company or from a client, or maybe we just don't want to that's our decision. So it really isn't an unexpected interruption. It's one that that ideally we've consciously decided is worthwhile interrupting us from it. I also think in terms of if it's work-related, it's not really an interruption. It's just an opportunity to change the focus of my attention, because so many of our jobs require us to juggle these multiple balls, and if every time we have to switch from one to the other in order to be effective in our jobs, if we think of that as an interruption, that's kind of an unhelpful way of framing it. I think of it as, an opportunity to turn to something new, and it's just a little mental shift, but it changes it from a stumbling block to a stepping stone. So there are no uninvited interruptions. If it's there at some level, you've invited it, and I suggest you decide for yourself that you've invited it, because the worst scenario is to leave everything on and then get annoyed when the calls come in, because ultimately it is your choice. It boils down.
Okay, great. This is a very popular question. This came in from multiple attendees today. What mobile apps do you use or can recommend to keep track of to-dos, tasks, calendar deadlines?
Wow.
That's definitely a Meg question.
Okay, well, let me tell you my philosophy of choosing apps. I don't think of myself really as a techie person in the sense that I don't get great joy about sitting down and doing research and figuring out which one of the 35 apps will work best for me. I'll do a little bit of research and I'll say, okay, what looks pretty good, and then I'll download something and say, does this work? And most of the time, the first one I download, it's absolutely fine, and I accept that and live with it and don't go seeking a magic bullet for something that's a little bit better. So I use the Outlook task function kind of as my case management system, because that's where I use the very granular, follow up with this client or double check with this and do that. But for larger things, I just keep my master list in a Word document and pull it up. And so calendar deadlines. So to-dos and tasks are one thing. For calendar deadlines, obviously, you'll put it in the calendar. I have a sort of an all-in-one everything calendar that I create in Word that I inspect each day to make sure I'm on top of things, and I look ahead several days, several weeks. But one of the things that to integrate the to-dos in the calendar, if there's something with a deadline, it goes on both. It has a calendar with the reminders. It's also in the task management system with the deadline spelled out. So figure with belt and suspenders, you have to try really hard to miss that deadline because it's kind of in multiple places. How about you, Sally? What do you find helpful?
I'm definitely an Outlook person, and so I use my Outlook calendar for almost everything. And I'm a big paper list person, but I don't like to have loose paper. So, this is my low tech side is I love a spiral notebook where I'm always dating it and writing everything down. And I'm sure Meg's heard me say this before. Things that have to be the to-dos get asterisks. I look through that notebook at the end of the day, and it goes on some electronic version of a list, whether it's an Outlook and a deadline. But those I'm sort of low tech. My husband and I use certain apps to keep up with each other, but that's not really my list. That's not what I use for my lists or to-dos.
Okay, great. Another question that came in was, I find that I'm spending so much time these days in Zoom meetings that I have trouble finding time to get my real work done. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with this?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. Should I jump in and address that first, Sally?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Especially, it's so interesting because I think at this point we're all kind of fluent in Zoom, and it's just so interesting how much more demanding it is to do that than to be in a physical meeting. But the way I deal with it is it still is just another meeting. It still is, if you're in a Zoom meeting, or because it's either something's getting done or your boss thinks something should be getting done. But I suggest look at Zoom meetings as any other meeting and use the same kind of meeting hygiene that we would always want, which is, if it's work-related, and especially if you're the one calling it, have an agenda, have a plan. Certainly build in some time to go around and have a little, socializing, have people just kind of catch up what they're doing. But the way I look at it is, if it's work-related, it is quote-unquote real work. But I also say, to the extent you have any control over when those are scheduled, if you find that it's just constant, try to block off some time so you don't accept, if you're in a position to do so. If you don't accept Zoom meetings during your high productivity times, maybe before like 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, and then put the Zoom meetings until later. Because the thing about meetings is you kind of have, you do it even if you're not at your best because you kind of have to because you're there. Whereas if you're actually, producing and writing and doing your big thinking, that really requires sometimes more focus. So I like to get that done earlier in the day. So scheduling the meetings, for later in the day, I find is one thing that can help. How about you, Sally?
So agree. I mean, I think it helps to block time on your calendar where Zoom meetings can't be scheduled. If you need that time to stay up to date on the things you need to get done. The other thing I think I have found is super important is that at the end of the meeting we try to do a wrap up with our action items. And the action items, I think it's very valuable to have someone's name next to them who's supposed to do them, because sometimes I find you have a meeting and then you have a second meeting really because everybody left the first meeting and no one was quite sure who was supposed to do what. And so I think it's important to have action items that are actually assigned with timelines, and then a lot of times you don't have to have that second meeting. The rest of it can be maybe resolved with an exchange of emails. And so totally agree with what Meg said, other than, I think the action items helps me maybe not to have an unneeded second meeting.
No, I agree, Sally, and I think it's probably even a good idea at the end of the meeting that somebody send out an email saying, okay, just to summarize, we decided this, that, the other, and this person will do that with this deadline, and the other person will do that. So at least you've started the email paper trail on that.
Okay, great. Well, at this point, we are out of time for further questions. That concludes today's event. On behalf of Attorney Protective, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar, and I would also like to thank our speakers, Meg and Sally. So thank you so much, and have a great day.